A bold and original thinker, deeply connected with her communities through an abiding willingness to re-examine and reimagine queer lives by integrating new ideas, challenges, and experiences. Nestle dazzles as a powerful thinker, writer, and theorist. That is the byline on Joan Nestle's newest collection, printed by Sinister Wisdom, A Sturdy Yes of a People. This collection prints some of her most iconic essays over the last 50 years. Joan Nestle, co-founder of the Lesbian History Archives, writer of A Restricted Country, an activist and teacher, a woman who needs no introduction, but to introduce the intergenerational panel that Sinister Wisdom presents to you today, I would like to read a few lines from A Passion in Our Politics. Our history is the history of desire and all the wonders that desire can give birth to, out of fragments and out of fear, out of shame and out of judgment. We have built a history of resistance. We have told the tale of loving and then worked hard to give our passion a place in this world. Please enjoy this gathering of intergenerational scholars, learners, listeners, queer people, and lovers. Please, if you do enjoy this program, please consider supporting Sinister Wisdom by subscribing to the journal at sinisterwisdom.org/subscribe. You can subscribe for as little as $10. And if you enjoy anything that you hear today and are interested in the collection, please consider picking up the collection at sinisterwisdom.org/Joan Nestle. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. Do we want to now briefly go around and introduce ourselves for the benefit of everyone else that's going to be listening to this?
Sure. Well, I'll start. I'm Ange, based in Naarm, which is Melbourne. I live where Joan lives, and I've had the privilege of having her in my life for the last couple of years. Currently doing some slideshow work with her to be uploaded to LHA and for the archives here. And otherwise, I make some queer art and I'm generally involved with the queer scene here, and my pronouns are she, her.
Thanks for having me. So I'm Ali. My pronouns are he and him. I live in Broome, Western Australia, in Yarra country, but I'm here in Sydney on Gadigal country today, and I work in publishing, and I'm a writer and a journalist, and I've known Joan since 2015, but been a reader and a fan of her work since years before that, when I started reading her work back in 2010 or 2009 or so. So thanks for having me here. It's nice to meet you all.
My name is Sarah. I am super thrilled to be here. My pronouns are she and they. I am a journalist primarily. I also do work with Sinister Wisdom in various capacities. It's great to be here.
Hi, my name is Maya. My pronouns are she, her. I am a full-time student based in New York City, and I am currently finishing up my undergraduate, and I expect to start graduate school in the fall. I primarily do writing, creative nonfiction writing that's heavily based in Black lesbian feminist theory.
My name is Srishti. I am an undergraduate student right now, also based in New York. And we are both friends of Olivia's, who works closely with the Lesbian History Archives, and with Joan, and we thank you for having us tonight.
I am Joan, and first I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands unceded of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and I am the luckiest person. For those of you I have known in body and flesh in my lives, and for those of you I've heard about and I'm seeing for the first time, and I am here with gratitude for your taking in of my work.
Excited to help facilitate a conversation about the intergenerational nature of Joan Nestle's newest collection, A Sturdy Yes of a People. I'm a big fan of Joan's work, and I
am just impressed at the breadth and depth of the collection. I think that it covers a lot of ground in very pertinent ground that I think is still relevant today. And I'm curious to hear what you guys think the most pressing themes in 2023 are that are found in this collection. What stands out to you as a contemporary reader? Well, I could go first to break the ice. I thought there was some interesting parallels in the dialogue happening in Joan's essay about butch femme relationships in the 1950s, and sort of the dialogue happening today between the inclusion of trans lesbians, non-binary lesbians, as kind of upholding the patriarchy in some ways, or being disgraces to the lesbian community. I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that.
I honestly also found that essay really interesting because it's very good to have some historical insight. I think for a lot of lesbians, it's very difficult to find your history. For example, I'm very lucky to be attached to an institution where I can find a lot of things, but even still, a lot of lesbian history is not accessible. And so by Joan like recording it from somebody who lived during the 1950s and then through the second wave feminist movement and on to the other ones that have followed, it allows a sort of framework to have things to look at rather than all of us, talking and trying to figure out what we can from things that some people might remember, things that other people might have gotten wrong. So I thought it was very relevant to today's conversation in giving us a sort of anchor.
Yeah, I completely agree. I love that essay. As a femme lesbian, as someone who is married to a butch lesbian and dates butches and really prioritizes those kind of butch femme relationships, it was really fun to read. I think particularly because, and this isn't necessarily to this particular moment, but I think in general there's a lot of I think backlash is kind of a harsh word, but there's a lot of critique towards butch femme relationships as if they are heteronormative. And throughout, I think, the book, we're really getting into, well, the differences between, femme and femininity, lesbian identity, and its tension with womanhood. And I think, to Sierra's point, too, there's always been a fascination with gender in lesbian communities, and there's always been a really strong showing of gender nonconformity and trans adjacent or trans identities. So I think there's a lot of solidarity between those communities, and I also don't think that there's the lack of overlap that I think a lot of people insinuate. There's a lot of overlap. So yeah, those are just some thoughts. I'm excited to hear what other people have to say.
Yeah, I think that you're. Oh, sorry. You go.
I thought it was particularly.
No, I just
You
wanted to
can
say
go
I agree
ahead.
with you about the idea that there's still a fascination with gender play and gender roles in like our communities. That has always, and like I think Joan's work is a great reminder that that's always been a critical exercise, which is like quite important and heartening, I think.
I think it's really interesting to read this chapter in today's context with social media. I don't know how many of you guys are on TikTok, but right now there's kind of been like a resurgence of academic discourse. I think that is well intentioned by a lot of young lesbians about quote unquote protecting butches and what it means to exist in a butch femme relationship. And a lot of them, as Maya was saying earlier, come to their opinions because of a lack of connection to either lesbian elders or lesbian history. It's really no fault of their own. We are so privileged to be here tonight and have access to the knowledge that we do have. But because of it, unfortunately, we're kind of stuck in a lot of cycles of conversations that have already, in many ways, been either resolved or have been articulated much better by our ancestors and those who've experienced these dynamics in a time that's much more meaningful, I think, than TikTok.
Yeah, I don't have anything further to add. I mean, I agree 100%. I think there's, with those parallels, when we talk about all the sort of sub-communities, like under the sort of lesbian or queer umbrella, we're also looking at history in that same way, and we think about like lesbian history, and we can think about lesbians in history. So, moving within several movements and different kinds of identities always kind of being present, I guess. But yeah, like Maya was just saying about the rehashing old arguments. It's an exhausting conversation to have. But the essay about it is just a lovely reminder of what it means to be like your authentic self, and to consciously move into gender play or gender identity that feels authentic, and how that ultimately is the difference between like that heterosexual pairing and I'll say performance because all genders performing, but an unconscious performing versus an authentic kind of queering of gender, and how that would look for whatever version of kind of lesbian sexuality we end up with.
Can I say something without? All right. Well, I don't do, I guess is the verb you use, I don't do TikTok. But I want to say that I don't want you to be over-referential to the past, in the sense, yes, I can see the connections, but you will have to find your own ways and your own languages and your own, how can I say, your own tenderness and at the same time strength to take on the new, I don't know, the new narrowing of thinking is what I'm saying, but that already reveals my, but yes, so for instance, this use of the word, the first time where I just saw the blasphemy of the term woke being used against a lesbian person who supports the diversity of our genders and identities. Now, so we've lost Maya, but you will have to find, even though you have the history to support you, it is from a different time, and you're going to have to find your own ways through the politics of now. In any way that the past can help, let it. But your own strengths will be called on. See, I'm not going to talk anymore.
I think that part about like not being overly referential. Sorry, Olivia's joined us. But I think about that part about not being overly referential is very important. I think that, especially in the context of now, in a lot of conversations, people are either completely divorced from the history or solely rooted in a very singular context in history. And I think it's very important to adjust for the context of now. I think lesbianism and queerness as a whole is constantly evolving. And I love referencing Jose Esteban Munoz's quote about how we are not yet queer. I think if you want to even narrow it down, we are not yet lesbians in the sense that we are, but we're moving towards the best form of lesbianism we can be, in which all of us can feel safely accounted for and fully able to exist in this space. And I think that can be limited by that over-referencing of history.
Come on, let's fight somebody.
That was great. Thank you for joining us, Olivia. It's nice to see you. Do you want to introduce? Oh, do you want to introduce yourself?
Nice to see you too. Sorry. Sure. What were people saying in the introductions?
Names, pronouns, your relation to queerness.
Oh,
How you know Joan?
Oh, okay. So my name is Olivia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a dyke. I'm a lesbian. That's my relation to queerness. How do I know Joan? I volunteer at the Lesbian History Archives. That's how I know Joan. And through working with Mabel Hampton's photo collection, I feel like I've looked at Joan's face hundreds, maybe thousands of times just from back in the 80s. So there's that. That's how I know Joan, kind of.
What do you do?
What do I do? Oh, I'm a librarian in training. Okay.
I can speak if nobody else wants to speak yet. But I was really captivated by, actually, maybe this doesn't feel like a hot topic or something that would trend on social media at the moment, but I wanted to talk a lot about the presence of archiving and all the different ways that it takes place in the book. And the piece about your mother journaling, Joan, like talking about your mother's journals, was really, really stunning, stunningly described, I think, and made me think about journals as a really vital part of history preservation, but also made me think quite a bit about how you describe the labor of her writing was really beautiful. So I think I wanted to talk a little bit about, if anyone has anything to say about this, I guess that sounds as though a few of you are actively involved in the archiving process at the moment, what those descriptions might mean to you and how you relate to that sort of work of touching the archival materials and organizing them and working with them and seeing them.
I can say a little bit about the archiving process, or like handling records or what that means. I guess in like the Lesbian History Archives context, it kind of feels like traveling through time, but I'm currently in like a current lesbian context, like I'm in a lesbian archive. I work with other dykes and other lesbians. And so I guess when I am touching ephemera or any of the stuff in the archives, it makes me feel more connected to a lesbian past while staying in a lesbian present in a way that you can't get just from like reading theory or reading a book. It helps me feel more in touch with my immediate lesbian ancestors and other workers in the archives, truly in a way that I hadn't experienced before from just reading essays or reading books.
Yeah, I'm not an archivist, but for some of my thesis work, I went through a collection of zines. And just, I remember what really struck me was just like the texture of the paper, knowing that it was like had been photocopied and recopied and been distributed like that, felt like the tactileness felt really cool to me, and to know that as I held it, it had been passed through like dozens of other hands and been read in a million different ways and passed along and then kind of ended up in my lap 30 years later. That was a really distinctive feeling that I recall, and it just, I don't know, the held form of certain things like photographs, zines, books just feels incredibly cool, and I think also like a meeting in time that I also really enjoy.
Yeah, I had to do quite a bit of like artifact work, but like in a digital sense through scan things, scan books, scan photos and stuff. So I haven't had the opportunity a lot other than limited settings like visiting the Lesbian History Archive to like actually touch and hold pieces, which is also really great. But I think what the most interesting part is a lot of these things, like the nature of archives, they don't always exist with a very clear context. And I think it's very fulfilling to do the work of figuring out the context that they exist in, trying to read between the lines and look at the papers, look at the people who are listed, look at, the places that these images appear, how these images or objects were gotten. I also took a class on archiving last semester that really talked about the work of archiving and how a lot of archivists, and through knowing Olivia, a lot of archivists of modern times are now understanding their role in a bit more thorough way. It's not about like, simply having something. The handling of something is very important because archiving is both recording and erasing. Everything that is there, there's always an absence. Like presence is always equal absences. So I have to look at the things that I find for my research, things that I choose to write about, while also keeping in mind that with what I'm seeing, there are other pieces that are missing.
Just on that, how you mentioned the context, I'm thinking also of like the stories around like the gutter letters that Joan and others would have been, tipped off about an older woman or a lesbian woman having died, and before her family can come through and like throw everything out and, put all of this shame kind of into a bin to be forgotten, that people would be there to like rescue these artifacts and rescue these love letters. And, I know LHA has a number of them, and, I've only ever seen sort of photos of them, but like Joan and I have talked about that, but that idea of, you're getting the context of like why this has to be rescued, but then you're also like bringing this person's life literally into community because, it's quite likely that they were closeted or had a very, their identity was like, extremely suppressed. So you're also like welcoming their story and their life like into community even after they've passed. They become part of the archives where their story can be, read, and it's there for people to see and welcome, which I think is also, just another beautiful way that we can look at like those kinds of histories as well.
I guess another thing that I think about is kind of when you're working with marginalized histories or trying to capture marginalized histories, to think about collecting in a very different way than you would in like a traditional archival sense. And so one of the things I love about LHA is that there is an implicit understanding that all lesbian lives and all of artifacts of lesbian lives matter, and are worth collecting and are worth holding. And I think that is a really powerful, really important thing when you're thinking about lesbian lives and you're thinking about archival history, archival practices, processing and collecting, is the fact that if you're going to collect non-traditional lives, you have to have non-traditional collecting practices. And the fact that a lot of lesbian history really isn't documented, so you can't throw away a flyer, or you have to go into the gutter, like they mentioned earlier, to maybe find a letter, or you have to seek out specific people. You actually have to be ingratiated in the community whose collections or whose artifacts or records you hope to actually maintain and keep. And there's also a lot of understanding in thinking about erasure. I feel like that was built into a lot of lesbian collecting practices, is the fact that it is a sliver of a sliver. And the fact that what you're trying to do is actively work against this erasure. Like I feel like with archival collecting practices, and also like, at least at LHA and also with other marginalized people and communities, like the Schomburg, we're going to talk about like dual collecting histories of like collecting Black lives and collecting lesbian lives or queer lives, is that this was a response to the fact that history was being ignored, or history was I don't want to say deleting, that's not the word I'm thinking of. What's the word I'm thinking of?
Erased.
Oh, thank you. Erased right in front of their eyes. And so I think that every time like you pick up a lesbian object or a record, there's like this inherent gratefulness that you feel, or you're like a lot of effort, time, resources. There's a lot of grief and sadness, pain, love, joy within just like one object. Maybe more so than in other institutions or other collections.
On that point, I just want to draw attention to something that I really liked. It's on page 364, and it starts mid-sentence. It's at the top of the page. Yet, while I know that living in the pre-liberation gay ghetto endangered my life, remembering it gives me life. And I can very, thankfully, gratefully say that living right now as I am a lesbian in the United States of America, at least, I do get to enjoy so many things that the people did not before me did not. And furthermore, complicating it by my ethnic and racial background, it's comforting to see someone whose practice of remembering is simultaneously hopeful rather than just one that is marred with, sadness. I often feel overcome by the losses that a lot of South Asian lesbians, specifically in South Asia, feel on a daily basis. But, this little one line helps me, or like not just helps me, but like I guess grounds me in the possibility of a future where I look back at this time with a sense of meaning that, remembrance allows.
If I may also just like briefly add on, I think another interesting, oh, sorry, I don't know what that was. I think there was a notification. I think another thing is that like remembering can often be framed in a passive light, but like Olivia was saying earlier, with marginalized histories, specifically marginalized lesbian histories, there's a sense of urgency and a sense of action. Everything that is collected, everything that is recorded is fueled by a drive to bridge some of those gaps. And if not bridge those gaps, prevent further gaps from existing in the future. And that part is very invigorating. It takes, some of the grief from remembering and also charges you to want to not only find the sad, empty pockets, but also find the areas that were hidden but full of life and fully dimensional lesbian life. And I feel like that, like this entire book in general, but also that essay really did incorporate the meaning of what it means to find that life and reinvigorate it with new life.
I would add that for me, it's just desire is like that joy, that base level for a lot of the work, even things that aren't explicitly sort of smutty or sexy. There's a real desire for connection, desire for community, the sort of graying of like sexuality into sensuality, and thriving in those kinds of spaces. I feel like, and I mean, Joan, you've said this a million times about desire being your kind of base. So it's sort of so strong, that sense in the writing as well, I think.
I don't want to miss a word of what you have to say, but I want to just say, I'm thinking now, and what I'm reading here, like what's happening in some of the southern reactionary states, and the things you're talking about, like intersectionality, right? That's a dirty word now in what I call, this is my word, and it's, again, from my proto-fascistic conversation. So I'm thinking everything that, and I also want to pick up, because I'm learning so much. When you said, like, identities are evolving to be what they will need to be. So are archives. They are evolving to be what they will need to be. And you, this is why I was so thrilled by this intergenerationality, because it will be you. You are the next voice of becoming. And I'm so grateful to be here with you all.
I think now would be a good time to bring into the conversation a woman by the name of Amel, who runs the Kwarma archives. I don't know, maybe Joan, you would best be able to introduce her?
Well, as the perfect time, we're talking about archives in the becoming, and there are two new or newish archival projects. One that we're talking about now is Kwarma, which is the Indian archives of memory and activism. And Amal is the director. And when you get an understanding of the cultural complex undertakings, the activism that is involved, it's breathtaking. And the other archives that's new in the world is the Queer Indonesia, and all of these have strong presences of all of you represented here. They are, it's lesbian, it's trans, it's queer, and all the other versions in different cultures that these desires and genders take. And Amal has been wonderful. LHA and Amal are working together, so LHA can be introduced to the Indian audience, and LHA can be introduced to Kwama.
Hello, my name is Amel Sharon, and I work with the Queer Archive for Memory, Reflection and Activism at the National Law School of India University in Bengaluru. I've recently been drawn into the warm archival embrace of Joan Nestle and have been touched by her generosity and imagination. So I'm really glad to be reading and rereading this fantastic book that Sinister Wisdom sent to us. And I'll say about three things from an archiving perspective in response to this book. So one is reading the archives section and the education section brought home to me the role and importance of amateur archivists in galvanizing different members of queer communities and recognizing that everyone has something to share. And related to that is that independent archives come out of their particular circumstances, which informs their methods, their approach to their collections, the way in which they catalog and present them. And this is a good caution against homogeneous professional standards. And I think that's great to keep in mind and something that we've learned from the Lesbian Her Story archives. The second point I wanted to make was that Joan's singular sexy voice makes it possible to have conversations between queer archives. And this is something that we've been pursuing with the Lesbian Her Story archives, and it's been a great experience. In particular, it deepened our belief that physical in-person archives can facilitate difficult conversations, particularly intergenerational conversations, that may not be possible in activist or scholarly spaces. And to illuminate this point, I want to think about the essay Joan has called Wars and Thinking, where she reflects on her journey and relationship with Adrienne Rich. Adrienne Rich travels well. When I was growing up, Rich's books were available in the bookstore in my small city at a time when no other queer or lesbian books were available. But what Joan does is also register her disagreement with Adrienne Rich, as well as, or together with, care and understanding, particularly an understanding that is rooted in recognizing the vulnerability of the body. And this narrative arc that Joan provides us, I think, is key to what archives can also do, where texts can belong to their time. And so the in-person interactive space that the Lesbian Her Story archives is provides us this journey. And I'm very grateful for the many insights that this book provides. I want to thank Joan for it, for putting the time and remaining energetic um, in her belief, and to all the women who've kept lesbian her stories alive and continue to share. So see you soon, Joan, and thank you.
That listening to her reminded me of something, Joan, about a few years ago. You were speaking to me about a disagreement that you'd had with Audre Lorde. You were saying that you'd exchanged like a number of like letters with Audre back in the 1980s. And I can't remember the exact topic that you were disagreeing on, but I was really impressed by it because I think that it sounded as though you'd managed to have quite a heated disagreement with each other, while also really maintaining a tone of deep love and respect. And you said that she'd sort of maintained that you were really precious to her. And I was quite taken by that description of a disagreement and a difference, like quite a deep difference in belief systems that you two had been negotiating. And the fact that you'd managed to maintain such a strong bond throughout that. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that disagreement that she was describing that you had with Adrian Rich.
Oh, you're muted, I think.
I just don't want to. My relationship with Adrian was limited. I wasn't a close friend. But in the 70s and 80s, she and Michelle Cliff, who was her partner at the time, were great supporters of the beginning of the archives, and we moved in similar circles, only I was little and Adrian was big already, so I was very much in awe of her. And but the difference, as you have said, I think Maya said it, and was in our histories. Adrian came from a it's so hard, now that it's hard when you lose your friends and your peers and your teachers and those who created cultural life for you, and then to talk about them as if you have a right. I find it. She came out into feminism and she had been married, she'd had children, all which was difficult. That didn't make it any easier. But they were taboo subjects at the time. Both she and Audre Lorde, didn't feel they could talk about their married lives in the fervor of lesbian feminism. And what was the difference between us was my position in the sex wars. So that was what that conversation was. And the height of it was, and I'm very aware of talking too much. You don't know, for me, what a rare gathering this is. Sierra, you have done it to bring us all together. Thank you. Adrian was always asked to speak at things, and she called me. We both lived on the Upper West Side, so we would see each other. But she called me and she said, Joan, I've been asked to talk at, it's Take Back the Night Marches now. Take Back the Night Marches were started as demos against violence against women, but they quickly became demonstrations against sex workers. They became, so this Take Back the Night March was to be held by Women Against Pornography. Well, these are old things, but they're new in your life in different ways. And they wanted Adrian, they were going to have a march down the Sex District of 42nd Street, and then a rally, and they wanted Adrian to speak at it. And Adrian called me, and this is what I'm so moved by. I mean, really, I was just a little grassroots archivist. And this recognized worldwide poet calls me the night before. I mean, we'd been at the lesbian parties, we'd flirted, but And she calls me and says, Joan, what do you think I should do and why? And I was always a little nervous talking to her. And I said, look, Adrian, I say to you, don't do it. Because what they would do on this march, they would stop in front of the places where sex workers worked. And they would scream up at them, and there would be this great outpouring of anger. And I said, sex, that's endangering the lives of sex workers, besides everything else. And I have to say, one of the failures in my time of the movements of feminist, queer, lesbian, I won't speak of trans because I think it's different, was the erasure of sex workers from our history. And this is something I can say Kwama is not allowing to happen. I mean, there are all different takes on this. But, and again, I'm not saying I'm speaking the truth. But Adrienne listened, and she didn't speak at that rally. And that, to me, you know, cemented my respect for her, even though we moved in different worlds. Right? And I couldn't take her saying, or I didn't accept when she said all women are lesbian or potential lesbians, because I felt that was ahistorical. I felt like, oh, no, the butch femme women who came out in the 30s, 40s, 50s, the trans people that existed then, well, no, they lived very real lives of repression and violence. And so I thought that was being erased. Now, I'm not saying I was right. The thing is, we are lucky to have Adrienne Rich's voice. It travels the world and it gives life. That's endlessly grateful for. And you know, once they start banning books, they'll ban hers as well. They'll ban Pat Califia's. They'll ban sex workers' diaries. They will ban them all. So that's why we cannot allow our comradeships and our community to be broken apart by what we think, yeah. Did that help? Did I explain something, Arlie?
Definitely, I think that's really relevant and instructive, because I think I had a same, I wasn't asked to speak at Reclaim the Night at this particular occasion, but I was part of a collective that was attached to Reclaim the Night in 2010 in Melbourne, when I was a lesbian. But the march ended in a similar way, sort of started in one place and then made its way to the strip clubs, and then bricks were thrown at the strip clubs and megaphones were shouting at the strip clubs and this kind of thing, and that was in 2010. So you can see that the movement hadn't traveled very far, and I'm not sure what happens now with that particular event and like how the discourse might have changed, or if it has changed. Maybe, I don't know if anyone else here is connected to that movement at this time, but it was very frustrating. So I can definitely see that there's still residue of that that vitriol towards the sex workers, and that kind of erasure of their part in the movement was happening at that time. But I was most just reminded, I guess, of your ability to hold a lot of that sense of solidarity with the difference of beliefs that you held, and through, I guess, a lot of difficult conversations with your peers and your friends as well in the movement, which I think is really, really useful for people of my age to observe that kind of heavy discussion taking place and the relationship remained at the same time.
I think something that's also been like interesting. I think those movements are a bit before my time, but what I can say that I think has been interesting in the conversation as a whole on the role of like sex workers in both the lesbian community, but also feminist communities in general and other like, you know, activist communities, is that now we have the context of online, and now people are like, you know, having different conversations around that. I think an interesting thing that I've seen evolve and that I think is a positive thing is that because sex work is more visible than it was before, because we have these online platforms in which people are able to either talk about their experiences or also like, you know, use the platform to like, you know, aid in their work, we're able to see that like, you know, sex work is multidimensional, like all forms of work, and like any form of work, it's just another means of survival and a means of surviving this like capitalist place. And seeing a lot of lesbian sex workers speak and have their own platforms where they're able to like, you know, speak directly for themselves rather than be spoken for is very gratifying to see and great, especially trans lesbians who have to really have an even more nuanced experience with sex work and being like they get to speak on like, you know, their connections to the histories, the connections to the theory, the things that people have said, while also providing very real contextual life experience, which is inarguable. The experiences that they've had are there, and if you don't see it, you know, or you can't ignore it in that way. And I feel like in the past, sometimes they have been spoken over or ignored. So I hope that this is more of an emergence of them being able to have their own platforms to speak for themselves and advocate for themselves and actually be listened to.
One dream I've always had and is that we need many archives. We need an archives of sex work. The role of sex workers throughout history, European history, through the Nazi period, through their resistances, through the multicultural everything. And that will be, it's just the same thing for what happened to us from the 50s. When women came to visit the archives of my generation, they say, I never knew we had done so much. I tore up all those paperbacks because I was ashamed of them. And before my eyes, I saw what I always call deprivation turn to plenitude. I saw shame turn to history. And I was privileged, and I'm talking too much, and I'm sorry, Sierra, but I just love being in your company, to attend early in the 80s. It was called, I think, Sex, the Body and the State. And it was in Canada. It was in, I think it was Toronto. And it was the first time when sex workers spoke, had their own, spoke of their own history. And I was sitting with a group of sex work activists from Amsterdam who had come, watching them weep as a sex worker told the history of pole dancing. Now, if you think, and what it had meant, wasn't pole dancing, I'm sorry, but it was another form of sex work with dance. And what it was just a moment, and I said, I recognize this moment. This is when old-time lesbians looked at something that was being cherished because it was important human stuff. So the archives can do that. It's in the archives, by the way. That conference is in our conference.
I've got a sort of general question, and because I know that Joan wants to get people like into the weeds of like looking at her work with like, you know, younger eyes. I'm curious about people's take on Esther's story, particularly around the idea of, you know, I love the story, super hot, it's great. But if we like think about it in context of like, you're cruising someone and then you go home and then you take a bath in front of them and they fix your chair, it's like a real escalation. Is this like, do people think, is that just like a sort of 50s, 60s style of like hard U-hauling before we were like U-hauling, like taking a bath is foreplay, and the roses, buying a steak? I'm just like, wow, that's there's a lot of like straight up vulnerability, there's a lot of romancing, and I don't even know what words were spoken. I'm curious of people's kind of take on that story. Drop a bomb. I mean, that's something that I don't come from an academic background. I'm not particularly like well read, but that story and how it, like how the different dynamics are at play, the romance and the like, that sort of cruising and sensuality. I also love like the respective kind of curviness of, what people are appreciating about the other. And the description particularly of Esther fixing the chair. I mean, it's the dialogue being like, oh, no, you don't have to. And the butch being like, no, I'm going to. I've got the tools and I'm fixing this chair for you and it's happening right now. But also knowing secretly that, there's a butch power in that to be able to like fix that furniture. I should also say I am a tradesperson and my girlfriend, there's a hard objectification whenever I put on a tool belt. So there's also like that background. I'm like, yeah, I know what she's doing. I know she's been perved on. That's a vibe she's leaning in too hard, and it's like reciprocated with a sexy bath. But I also just I think that the story is wonderful. I also think like, wow, that's just it's a lot. Like, is it? If people are familiar, if you're not familiar with the story, that's okay. I just think, wow, we've gone like from 0 to 100 very quickly, in a way that's like the extended foreplay of eye contact, of appreciating people's bodies, but from afar without physical touch. It's a real escalation. I mean, for me, I'm like I'm the opposite of like a U-Haul kind of person. I am. And maybe that's not, I don't know, keeping with my generation, but I'm very much like, I like to sit back and just sort of like, I would never take a bath in front of someone I just met, is what I'm saying, or fix their chair. I mean, although if they did buy me a steak, which are expensive, I would probably fix someone's chair for that. I don't know. Curious if people were like charmed in that way, or if, that.
No, I'm super happy that you called attention to this story. I was just refreshing and leafing through it as you were talking, and I just think smut is so important. I think sensuality written in visual mediums of queer sex is so important. I think it has the ability to entertain and also to connect with people, and I think it really bridges the gap between less accessible academic language and lived experience. So I think it does a lot of the running work that I think can make more academic language feel like a homework assignment, whereas I think just kind of these representations of sex, these interactions between two people, like the particularities of a story and the characters and the people in it, I think do a lot for communicating desire and identity and politics. So I just think it's important, and I think it's also important too because for a lot of people there's no roadmap for queer sex. There's a lot of trepidation around it. There's a lot of fetishization. A lot of people's first access or look into lesbian sex is through fetish. And I'm saying fetishing as in fetishization, not like kink. That's a totally different story. But I think it's important too to hear and see and feel, and in your mind's eye picture yourself in these kinds of sensual, hot, explicit interactions. I think the pendulum can swing back and forth a little bit too between like oversexing and undersexing queer people. And I think this is a great example of that really important happy medium where queer people are sexual, but not hypersexual. You know what I mean? Like hypersexed by this kind of gaze. Yeah.
I do want to just take a second to say something just a little bit humorous. 2045, being 20 and bagging a 45-year-old butch, like, skill. That takes skill. That takes game. Like, big credit. Credit where credit is due. I can't imagine.
That's all you have to say?
That's all I had to say. What else am I gonna say? Like, that's all I have to say.
Wow.
And the character sort of says, like, there is nervousness there that doesn't seem to have an impact at all.
Could I ask you, in that story and in many others, the issue of class is very important to me. And I don't know if it is to you, or does it express itself in a different way? But that story really also was about many differences, with desire being the bridge. But it was also about class. So I'm just, did that have meaning for you in the book, or did it come through? Or did the language take it away, except in the stories? Do you know what or is class important to you in your time? Class differences, class histories, class exchanges?
I would certainly say class is important in our time. I think specifically, again, it's very interesting to talk about how a lot of, like, you know, my experience as a lesbian has been mediated by the internet. But where I live in New York, I have an interesting privilege to be connected to a lot of lesbians that are from a lot of different class backgrounds. But I have seen the way that class can really affect people. There are certain, like, signifiers now that might not have had the same type of class background before. I think of something as simple as tattoos and piercings. Now, tattoos are like $200 into the thousands, especially if you want higher quality. And yet having a tattoo can be the difference between, like, you know, being recognized by your community versus not. It's very defining. I know for me, when I got my septum piercing, it meant the world to me, and still does, because I was like, I'm able to, like, you know, outwardly symbolize, like, my lesbianism is in some way that could be recognizable to the people who I want it to be. But I also think now that we exist in a world where everybody can be a brand and everybody is a brand at any time, that has been very interesting. I've known many lesbian influencers who are able to use their class to brand themselves and elevate themselves and gain a position in the community that is a very heavy position that should be wielded responsibly, but can not always be wielded responsibly. And class for me is also inherently connected to race. And I think that has been an issue with the lesbian community, especially in the internet. I think it's visibility in that sense. It has existed for a long time, obviously, but, like, now it's been very interesting to see the way desirability plays a role in the power that you have, because, you know, the lesbians who are very desirable and are able to perhaps prop up their platforms via their class are able to speak on things and speak with authority on things and get into spaces that other lesbians could only dream about. And I think that's very interesting. And I guess I would like to ask you, Joan, like, what would you say, what parts of class were a defining factor during your time that really mattered to you or really like stuck out to you?
I am learning. I am seeing a huge impact of social media and for revealing things. But let me just, class was in every moment of my life. So there's that in Esther's story. When I'm a working class young femme going to a free college, Queen's College at the time, but already in my head, I was creating a kind of class betrayal. And Esther, who was a taxi driver, a migrant from Puerto Rico, I already felt, I could see how just education could create class differences. And the conversation between us sexually was not only, her age and her knowledge, right? That was a class-driven knowledge. Esther had no protective devices of society. And the biggest thing, I always had to work. Since I was 13, I had to work. My father died before I was born. I had a mother who sometimes worked as a sex worker, who mostly worked as a bookkeeper. But I left home at 13, and I had to work now. That having to work defined my whole life. It meant, I couldn't do things that in the 60s and late 50s, others were doing because they had family behind them. So if they didn't have a job, they'd still have a place to live. If they didn't have a job, they'd still be able to get food. So the most important thing to me as a working class when I began, I'm quite more privileged, was, Joan, you had to survive every day. So you couldn't do the same drugs, and you couldn't, the only thing I could do and know that I could wake up for in the morning and go to work was sex. I couldn't overdrink. What I'm trying to say is I don't recognize, but I'm learning this phrase influences, and I'm seeing. This is like what you call what's the word I want? Capital. That use of cultural capital. It's almost like a created thing on the internet. You can almost, there's a wealth created by how many eyes are looking at you. But for me, class was the nitty-gritty of, will you have a place to live? Because without a job, you don't have a place to live. And then what did you have to do to have a job? So, I think, my writing is rooted in class, in survival class, with the recognition that I don't live the same life now. Well, I know, if this is helpful or make any sense to you.
Honestly, it's really helpful. I think I also wanted to, ask and also draw a connection. I know you lived during a time where queer people were really creating these really impactful art movements. But as you mentioned before, some people could have families behind them, which was a lot different. The amount of queer people who could back then versus now. But also we live in a moment where queer artistry is having a moment, having a time of real, not to say renaissance, but real growth and real drive behind it. And it's also interesting to see the people who are able to choose what they can do and how they can participate, because with an artistic scene comes a very flourishing nightlife scene, a flourishing party scene, a flourishing scene where different substances could be used. And I think it was very relatable to hear you say that I knew that there are things that I could do and couldn't do if it meant that I have to get up and survive tomorrow. So I think it was very, on the grander scale, it's a little bit like, sad that it still persists, but it's also very comforting to see that it's not unique and it's not specific to now.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to that too is I think that, yeah, you're correct in saying that there's like an emphasis on like queer art right now, which is very interesting. I'm a journalist, that's kind of my background. So a lot of my writing is, I pitch and I hope that it gets picked up, and then it gets, can you hear me? Did I go out for a second? Oh, okay, weird. It like disconnected, then connected. Anyway, so like my life is pitching things about queer people, queer communities, queer sex. I live in Florida. A lot of, a lot of what I'm working on right now is like Roe and like abortion access and like HRT and stuff like that too. So, and I, even in, the last 5 to 7 years, I feel like there's been a huge shift in what will get picked up and what stories people will pick up and publish and like put their brand behind. And also, I think it's still super mitigated by corporations. I think it particularly like in media, a lot of like independent feminist publishers have disappeared. Bitch media, is no longer with us. That was a huge loss. And now I'm kind of watching the rise of like Them, which is owned by Condé Nast and is like very corporate, and like so it's interesting too, the way that there's like this emphasis on like queer voices and art and things like that, but also it's through a lot of corporations, at least in my industry, which is a little bit terrifying, because I wonder, I ask myself, how long will this moment last? How long will editors, publishers, stakeholders be interested in publishing work about queer sex, queer lives, queer communities, queer activism, hormone care, reproductive justice? It feels very like tentative. So that also feels a little scary, especially because, there's these deaths of these incredible feminist independent institutions that are just happening. So yes, it's amazing, and I'm also very scared, so I think it's just interesting, I wonder like how long is this moment gonna last and what will it look like. No, one would obviously hope that there will be more independent like opportunities and things like that, and I think technology does bridge that gap a little bit, but it's still interesting because artists need to make money, writers need to make money, and the queer community needs to make money. So it's just interesting.
Just let me say, there was always, I'll say queer for everyone, queer art being produced, whether it was the young butch sewing a piece of lace on her socks before she went to the bar. There was always queer grassroots, born from the body under struggle and desire, always together being born. And here, and I know I'm beginning to see that I'm seeing some difference, I think, and Arlie, you can, and between what's happening in Australia and how you're seeing this almost an overabundance, yet at the same time threat in parts of America. But like here, there's a new press was just born called Thousand Threads Press. It's a grassroots press, and it's for trans and non-binary voices, and something is born almost every day, and it's born on it's born in a house, it's born when friends get together, it's born. So never, I don't want you to be disheartened. Desire is a creative force. I think Audre Lorde said that too when she talks about the erotica and its power. And even in the smallest of places, it gives birth to wonders.
I just wanted to, kind of come back to the queer art is like always being made. It just needs to, be platformed in some way. or even if it doesn't need to be platformed, it needs to be recognized, and it might start in somebody's house. And I just wanted to mention Olivia's master's thesis project really quickly. Olivia, do you want to explain it?
It's okay. You can, but I don't know where you're going with.
Right, sure.
I'm sorry.
It's an oral history project, and Olivia's collecting the oral histories of, I think, over 30 multiply marginalized lesbians. Multiply marginalized meaning lesbians who hold marginalities beyond just their sexuality, be that gender, race, class, or a multitude of all of those things combined. Disability as well. And in a part of that project, Olivia is going to be doing an exhibition. And part of that exhibition is displaying art that the participants have created and chosen to contribute. And just the sheer breadth of that art, we have things like fan fiction, things like paintings. What other notable items?
I have shirts people made, stained glass art, poetry, diaries, journals, like confessional letters people wrote, short films, essays, prints, other traditional forms of art, I guess. We have a lot of fiber work. Our other Black lesbian friend who couldn't be here, but they make jewelry, lots of lesbian jewelry like this. So that's going to be there too. Actually, they made this. So like this. Is that why you brought it up?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to talk about like how, like Olivia is obviously not an institution.
No.
And
not an institution.
Would you say that a good amount of the participants in your projects are class disadvantaged?
I would say almost all of them are. I would say like 80% are class disadvantaged.
And I just wanted to bring that back just to say that, like, class, be it as it may, is not an entire deterrence from art. And I think that often the best art is produced by those who may not see it as the opportunity to either brand themselves or find it as the single source of their income, or perhaps even those who see their art as the opportunity to be the visionary of a generation rather than, someone who is producing art alongside others. And I just wanted to bring up Olivia's project for that because I think it's a great example.
And I'll just add, the thing is too, that's one reason archives are archives, because someone is watching. Our archives is watching. Someone will keep a record. Our archives will. If it's people like you who are creating and keeping alive these archival hearts. And let me just say, how moved, how I long to be in your presences with my body for those who are not here close to me. How it was so important for me, for my work, and I say it almost feeling, oh, that's so pompous, for my book to be back in community's hands, for Sinister Wisdom. And I just ask you, keep your eye on Sinister Wisdom and all our other cultural creations, because this is a dangerous time. It can come from within. Some people may not like that Sinister Wisdom is putting out a trans feminist issue. It can come from the right. It can just keep your heart and your eye, and in your own communities, what is precious, what we can't lose, because too many communities would be lost in its erasure. And that's the word. I will think of you as the guardians against erasure. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Love to you all.